All right, we are back for our teen class here on Monday night. I appreciate those who are able to be here, those who are able to make it. Uh, we are in the book of Mark. We are looking at Mark chapter 5. We got about halfway through this book last time. So that's going to be where we pick up next time. We pick back up in verse 21. You'll remember the first 20 verses we talked about was about Jesus and the man with the legion, the man with many demons. You remember he crossed the Sea of Galilee. He met the guy in the graveyards. When he met the guy in the graveyards, he was a man that was in terrible pain and in terrible affliction. And that man, remember, nobody could bind him, nobody could chain him. And so he would break through everything. And so they talk about that. And Jesus heals him and makes him well. But you remember, as soon as the people around the city, around the area hear about it, they tell him to leave. They tell him to leave. It's one of the first times Jesus does a miracle and does something great like this. And people tell him to leave. But that's going to be something that happens. Some people were more scared of Jesus than because of his healing and because of this demon he cast out. They were wanting to hear what he had to say, than acknowledging him for who he really was. So that we ended that, and then we get into verse 21. In verse 21 and following says, and when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be able to be well and live." And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. So here's where we see that Jesus crosses back over to the other side of the Sea, Galilee. And when he gets to the other side, there's a great crowd. There's people who have gathered together to see him, to hear him, to watch him do his miracles. And they've come to see him on this other side. And as they're there on the other side of the sea, there's one of the men come to him. Now, you notice this is a ruler of a synagogue. A synagogue was in Jewish time about the equivalent of almost like a church. A synagogue was a gathering of Jews. They would meet, sort of like we meet at a building, a designated place, and they'd have worship every Sabbath. And this was one of the rulers. He'd be similar, some would say, to elders today. He would have that kind of authority, and he would be a man of power, and his name was Jairus. He comes to Jesus and sees him. He falls down at his feet. What's interesting about this is one of the few rulers or higher up people who actually acknowledged Jesus for who he was. He sees him, falls down at his feet, and basically bows down before him and begs with him, say, "Come with me." And you notice what he says, "Come, my little daughter is at the point of death." Now, I believe we find out either Mark, one of the other accounts, that this girl's about 12 years old. She is sick and at the point of death. She's sick and about to die. And so he's worried about her. And so he comes and finds Jesus and tells Jesus, "Come, lay your hands on her." Again, this shows us the faith of Jairus in that he begs Jesus to come, lay your hands on her so that she can be made well. If you'll just come and see her, you can heal her. You can make her well and know she can be well and live. Again, this sickness, we don't know what it is, but it was some kind of life-threatening disease. His daughter was on the what we would call a deathbed. And matter of fact, we're going to see in just a minute that she actually passes before Jesus gets there. And he knows verse 24, when Jesus saw this, he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. So Jesus and his disciples begin to follow Jairus, and they begin to follow. The crowds are already there, and as they try to make their way through the crowds go with them to follow. And the crowd is just pushing on him, and they're all clumped together in one space. And that leads us into the next part of the story, because this story we've seen in Mark 5 that Jesus has control over the demons. In Mark 4, we saw he had control over the earth. Now we're going to see him have control over disease, and then we're going to see him have control over death. And that disease happens in the next verse 25. Verse 25, and there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who has suffered much under many physicians, and has spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, if I even touch his garment, I'll be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Now, what Mark tells us here is we have this woman who's in the same town where Jairus is, or in that same area, and she's had this discharge of blood, meaning she's been bleeding. We're not exactly sure it is. It's some kind of, I will tell you this, it's some kind of feminine problem, some kind of feminine issue where she's had this bleeding, this discharge, and it was a continuous bleeding. Imagine that for 12 years to have that kind of an issue. In verse 26, Mark's the only one that includes this, probably because Luke wouldn't include this because he was a physician, but Mark would, to tell us exactly how it is, because Mark said that this woman has suffered much under many physicians. And Jewish medical doctors, regular Gentile medical doctors at this time were not the best. They were not very knowledgeable as we are today. They had all kind of various things. There was, I forgot some of the cures they gave for this. Some required carrying around ashes with you for a few days. Some required carrying around some other kind of burnt animal or burnt plant. Very weird cures that you would have to try to do. And so this woman has went to everybody she could to try to be healed. But when she goes to try to be healed, she goes to try to be healed, and nobody can do anything for her. No one can help her. None of that knows. Mark says she spent all of her money. We probably can relate to people like that. You may know people in your family, or you know people you've met who spent a lot of money on doctors, who spent a lot of money trying to figure out what's wrong with them, trying to get cured. And some of them get cured, some of them get the treatment they need, but some of them don't. Some of them spend all their money trying to heal something, and it just won't get better. Maybe it's because the doctor's wrong. Or you may know somebody who's went for years to one doctor, and this one doctor said he can't do anything. And then they finally go to another doctor, and that doctor says, oh, if you'd come to me years ago, I could have had this taken care of. I could have fixed this for you. That's sort of the idea of where this woman is. She has went to everybody she possibly could, but no one has been able to heal her. And she spent all of her money. And then, it's only that, not only has she not gotten better, but she's gotten worse. As time has went, these doctors and those who care for her have constantly made her not better, but worse. And so she came to Jesus, she hears about Jesus. She hears about this man who can heal diseases, who can heal anybody can. If anybody was desperate to be healed, that was desperate to try anything, it was this woman. And she had heard reports. Now, this is a very interesting thing about Jesus, is that those who simply touched his garments were healed. Or at least that was the rumor. We don't know of anybody else who was able to do this, but that was what she had in plan. Notice she had heard words about it, and she had planned as she came up behind him, then she could touch his garment. She could touch his cloak, touch his coat, and she would be made whole. Now, what would happen in their time is you may think, well, how would they do this? Well, in their time, you typically wore a wrap that was under your clothes. It was like your underclothes. That was what you had. Then you'd have a cloak on the outside, a robe. And on this outer robe, certain Jews would wear these tassels. Under the law of Moses, it specified certain people were supposed to have 4 tassels on their clothes, and these tassels were long cloth that would hang on these garments. So it's thought that that's what she's talking about, coming and touching, because he talks about touching the hem of his garment in some places. She wants to touch just the edge of Jesus' clothes. You notice in verse 28 again, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. Now, that tells us a few things. One, it tells us the faith this woman has, but also tells the desperation this woman has. This desperation of her situation, that she has to have something to fix this. And this is another thing that's very interesting, a story to me, is this woman doesn't want to approach Jesus. Now, there's a few reasons for that. Number one, in their culture was very different than our culture. In their culture, for a woman to go out, the woman had to have her head covered. She had to have her head covered, her head wrapped. The only thing you see is her eyes. If you still see images from the Middle East today, you'll see women who are wrapped up from head to toe. That's how it was in the ancient world. You could only see their eyes. That was all you could see for someone. And then when you were in public, it wasn't proper for a man to address a woman. If we were still under the same laws as they were under, a class like this wouldn't work. We'd have to have either a female teacher, we'd have to have more males present, because it wouldn't be proper for a male to speak to a female or a female to respond to a male in that setting. And so here's this woman who's afraid to come to Jesus. And not only that, this woman has been in a dire situation because for 12 years she's had this discharge of blood. And for 12 years she's been unclean. Because one of the things about the law was that when you were unclean, you were unable to worship God, or unable to go to the temple, excuse me. There were certain things you were not able to do when you were unclean. And one of the ways that made you unclean was to have an issue of blood or have blood that would bleed out. And so this woman was not just a woman, but she was unclean. She was probably someone who was pushed to the outskirts of society because she had this discharge of blood. She was probably like a leper. Remember the lepers, they'd have to live outside town and have to tell anybody if you got close to them unclean. This woman would probably be in a very similar situation. And so she's in this group and she comes to Jesus in this huge throng of people, thinking that all she's got to do is to just touch his garment and everything's going to be made well. And she's going to touch his garment, be made well, then she's going to get away and nobody's going to ever be the wiser. And then you know, verse 29, that as soon as she touches the garment, again, we see Mark's favorite word. Mark's favorite word is immediately. This miracle was instantaneous. There was no delay. He immediately, the flow of blood stopped. This woman was healed. And notice, she felt in her body that it was healed. This woman, whatever Jesus did, could physically tell, could physically know that she was healed, that she was made well. There was no question, no concern about it. She was where she needed to be. And you can imagine this woman is on cloud nine. She's happy about this because her plan has worked. Her scheme to come up behind Jesus and touch his garment, be made whole, has worked. And it has worked to perfection. The only thing is, she doesn't quite realize who Jesus is. Because notice verse 30 says, beginning back in verse 30, and Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, and immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowds pressing around you, yet you say, who touched you? Or who touched me? And he looked about to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, be healed of your disease. Now, notice verse 30. As soon as this woman touches Jesus, this is another thing about miracles we don't quite understand, is that Jesus could tell something happened to him. Notice, he perceived, he could tell that the power had gone out from him. And as soon as he feels the power, he stops. Now, again, imagine last time you've been in a big crowd. Here lately, you've not been in any big crowds. I'd hope not. But remember some of the biggest crowds you've ever been in, maybe at a football game or shopping or for Black Friday or any of that stuff. And imagine being with somebody in that group, say it's your mama or your daddy, and you're going through that and everybody's bumping into each other. You're just all trying to go the same direction. Everybody's crowded in. And all of a sudden, one of them stops, your mom or dad, whoever's with you, stops and looks at you and says, who touched me? Who touched my garment? You know, you would have the baffled reaction the disciples have. Because the disciples say to him, look, there's a crowd. There's so many people here. I don't know who touched you. We all probably touched you. We all bumped into you. What do you mean who touched you? But see, the problem is the disciples do not realize that Jesus wants to know who touched him. Not because somebody bumped into him, he's going to expect them to say sorry, but because he knows he's healed somebody. Because he knows that he has healed and made someone well. And here's the other thing about this. I don't think Jesus asked this question because he doesn't know. Because remember, he was fully man and fully God. He had the knowledge. He knew who this woman was. Remember, he had the ability to tell what's on people's hearts and on people's minds. He knew who touched him. But Jesus stops and says, who touched me? Well, why? Because he wants the crowds to hear about this miracle. He wants the crowds to see this woman. And he wants this woman to admit, and again, I'm not saying this in a bad way of admitting what she did, but he wants this woman to admit that she's been healed and again made clean. And he knows verse 32, he looked around. He's looking for the one who's done it. And he knows verse 33, the woman. The woman who'd planned to come in, touch Jesus' garment, and leave, she gets caught. And she sees Jesus, and she knows what had happened to her. She knows that she'd been made well. She came in fear and trembling and fell down before him. She fell down before him. And this again tells me that she hasn't heard Jesus. She didn't know Jesus. She personally hasn't probably heard Jesus preach. She has heard rumors about it, remember? And so this woman comes and she falls down in fear and trembling. She is afraid of what's going to happen. She's probably thinking that here he is. I took this away from him. Now he's going to curse me. Now this man is going to take away my healing. I can just imagine the different thoughts that's running through her head as she's there on the floor and the ground right before Jesus. And she tells him everything. She tells him about her disease. She tells him about what's happened to her. She tells him about the 12 years. She tells him about the doctors. She tells him about the medicine. She tells him about the treatment. She tells him about all the money that's gone. She tells him about how it got worse and worse. And she tells him that I came to you and I touched your cloak and I knew that I was made well. And I can just hear her, see her when she does this. Her waiting with bated breath, waiting with the idea to see what Jesus would say to her. And Jesus shocks her. Was one, he calls her daughter. And the idea of daughter wasn't he's acknowledged her as a physical daughter. That was one of the ways of acknowledging someone kindly. Still today, you may have some people who call you daughter or treat you like a daughter out of respect and care for you. That's what Jesus was doing here. Just like someone calls him out son. He says, daughter, your faith has made you well. Her faith was involved in it. And again, remember, this is not necessarily the faith in Jesus as the Son of God and Jesus as the believer, but the faith in the rumor, the faith that Jesus could do it. And you notice he says, go in peace. Don't be afraid. Don't be shy. Don't be terrified. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. Be healed. Be made whole. Be well. And so here we have this interaction. Now, this is the interesting thing about this story. Here we have Jesus getting off the boat. He's met with a man who says, my daughter is dying. I need you to come. I need you to heal my daughter. As he's on his way to go heal the daughter, another woman comes. Another woman who, yes, has a disease, but it's not life-threatening at this point. And she comes and she touches Jesus, and Jesus has to stop, and Jesus makes it to do about it. Jesus, in the mind of the Father, Jesus is wasting time before he goes to his daughter. And I want you to get that idea in your mind before we go to these next few verses. Because here Jesus is on his way to heal this girl. He stops and heals another woman and talks to her. The whole time this other girl's on her deathbed. And Jairus, in his mind, and this is understandable, just as in John 11, where he talks about Lazarus, most of Jesus' believers, followers, knew he had the power to heal, but they had in their mind that he had the power to heal as long as they were living. When they died, then there was nothing he could do about it. And this is what Jairus thinks as well. And then notice what happens next to Jairus. There's verse 35. Verse 35, while he was still speaking, while Jesus is still talking to the woman, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. Now, let's look at these verses before we look at the rest of the story. So Jesus is here talking to this woman. He's talking to this woman on the way to Jairus' house. Again, we're not told how far Jairus' house is away or how far it is from where you're at. But as he's talking, people come from the house. People come to meet Jairus and say, it's no use. Your daughter's passed. Your daughter's died. Don't trouble the teacher any longer. Don't trouble the rabbi. Don't make him come to the house. Let him go about his business. Let's go back home and let's mourn what's happened to this young girl. And you can imagine how this preacher or how the synagogue ruler must have felt. Imagine having the man with the cure for your loved one being so close, but not making it in time, not being able to make it and to heal. That's probably how Jairus felt. But Jesus overheard them. Jesus knew what they were saying. And Jesus said to Jairus, do not fear, only believe. He puts it on Jairus. He says, make a choice. Don't fear. Don't fear your daughter's died. Don't fear it's too late. Know that I can still do something. Know that I can accomplish what I came here to do. Notice, do not fear, only believe. And then Jesus gets to the house. And the only one he takes in the house are Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Now, the reason he chooses these three men, we don't know. These three are what's called the inner circle of Jesus. Jesus has three men who are very close to him. When we see Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, when Moses and Elijah come and they speak to him and God speaks from heaven about his son, these three men are here, Peter, James, and John. When Jesus goes in the garden to pray and he leaves the other disciples one way and he goes a little further and prays some more, these three are the ones that go a little further away and he goes a stone throw away from them to pray. These three were very key. Well, why? Well, there's a few reasons people think maybe one. One, Peter is the first one to preach a gospel sermon. In Acts 2, Peter's the one who stands up on the day of Pentecost and he proclaims that gospel message. John is the oldest living apostle. He is the one who lives the longest. Let me say that. He lives in nearly 100 AD or sometime in 100 or thereabouts. John lives to be an old man. James. Now, James is one people wonder about, but James is the first apostle to die for his faith. In Acts chapter, I think it's 11 or 12, we see James dying at the hand of Herod. Maybe earlier than that, maybe 5, I can't remember. But anyway, James is the first, not 5. James is one of the first apostles, or is the first apostle to die. So some people think that's why Jesus chooses them, because Peter preaches the first sermon, James is the first one to die, and John's the one that's going to be here the longest. He wants these three men to know what they're doing, to see what Jesus has done. And so they come into the house, and when they come to the house, they notice there's a loud commotion. There's a lot of people here. Now, the thing about this, we read this and we think, okay, well this is just normal, people crying and upset. That's true, but also in Jewish times, you had people you paid to mourn. Depending on how well off to do you were, you would have people who would come in and cry, and they would wail and weep with you. And depending on how rich you were, and Jairus being a ruler of synagogue probably was well off. He probably had a lot of people here that were paid to come and weep with him. They would have trumpet players that would come and play. History says that if you're poor, you have 2 trumpet players come play. So there's no telling how many may have been here for this young girl. You know how people spend whatever they can for their loved ones, especially children. So there's a huge people here that are wailing and crying and weeping. And again, these people who are paid to weep, they did it loudly. They did it with gusto. And when you wept and you wailed, you would tore your garment and you would be considered unclean. And you would be considered to not be able to repair the garment you tore for 30 days. And so these people come, wouldn't be unclean, just couldn't repair their garment for 30 days. So Jesus comes and sees this loud group here crying and wailing. And it's not just the family. This is people who have been paid to come in and do this. And notice what Jesus does, verse 39. And when he entered, he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Notice what Jesus does here. He comes into this crowd that is weeping and wailing and making this emotion, and Jesus comes in and basically says, hush. Why are you doing this? The girl's not dead. She's asleep. Well, why does Jesus say that? Does Jesus not know she's dead? Yes, he knows she's dead. But Jesus knows what he's about to do. And I think this is Jesus downplaying this miracle. He's about to heal her, but he's trying to plant the seed in everybody's head that the girl's not dead. She's just fallen asleep. That the people taking care of her have been deceived. Well, why? Well, if Jesus is told to be able to raise people from the dead, then you've got another group of people who's going to bringing him people to come to him. And again, this could get pretty out of hand. And so I think that's what this is. I think this is a part of Jesus' miracles that Jesus doesn't really want to reveal and to show yet that he's able to do. So he tells them, just be quiet, get out of the house. The child is sleeping. You need to let her sleep. And again, this is not a lot. Because one of the ways the Bible will adequately describe death is sleeping. Is sleeping. And that's sometimes that's the way parents have used to describe death to their children for years. That they just went to sleep and they're not going to wake back up. You know, I don't know how many funerals you've been to, but when you go to a funeral home and you see that person in the casket, if you had to describe that person, it looks like they're sleeping. That's what it looks like. And so Jesus says, she's not dead. She's just sleeping. You all need to get out of this house. Let me do my thing. Let me do what I need to do, and let me take care of her. And so he puts all them outside. Now, before he puts them outside, they laugh at him. They begin to laugh and say, oh, well this country teacher, and again, Jesus is from Galilee. It's like Galilee is, some people would say, is Mississippi and Alabama of Israel. It is the redneck country, if you will. And so this redneck guy comes in and says, y'all don't know what she's talking about. And she's not sick. She's asleep. Or she's not dead. She's sleeping. And they laugh at him. They laugh because they know that he's not telling the truth. They know that she's dead. They know that they're supposed to have to do something with her. But they put him out, and again, the mother and father appear to go with Jesus and agree with him. And they put everybody outside except for the father, the mother, Jesus, and those three men. And Jesus takes those three apostles so they can bear witness about what he did. And again, the witness is not for now, but it's for later. It's for when Jesus is gone. When Jesus resurrects and they can come back and say, well, Jesus did raise that girl from the dead. And so Jesus clears everybody out but the three guys with him. He goes into this little girl's room. He walks into where she is. He reaches down to where she is and he takes her hand. And she says, Talitha Kumi. And Talitha Kumi is Hebrew or Aramaic. What's interesting about this story is that this phrase Jesus gives here is the way Mark put it. Now, this is what Mark writing. All the words here are not someone else that put this Bible into English telling us what this means. This is what Mark said. Well, why does Mark have to tell us what Talitha Kumi means? Well, because the Romans that Mark wrote his book to, the Gentiles, they spoke Greek. They didn't speak Hebrew. It's about like if somebody tells you a Spanish phrase, you may not know what it means because you don't know Spanish. So what Jesus does here is Jesus says this in Hebrew. Now, the interesting thing about this, and let me go back to it real quick. The reason Jesus says this in Hebrew is because in Jewish households, what they would do typically is they would speak Greek out in the marketplace or out with other people. But when they were at home, they would typically speak Hebrew with each other. They would speak Aramaic. And so Jesus speaks to this girl as a loved one does, as one of her family members when he speaks to her in Hebrew. And then Mark, again, this tells us Mark didn't write to the Hebrews because Mark has to tell us what this means. Mark has to tell us, well, this phrase, Talitha Kumi, it means, little girl, I say to you, rise. Or I tell you to rise, little girl. And so as soon as Jesus says this little girl, we get to verse 42. And here we see Mark's favorite words twice in this verse. Immediately, the girl got up and began walking. Again, notice this. There's no delay. If you see anything of Jesus' miracles, I want you to see this. That when Jesus heals somebody, there is no delay. There's no hesitation. There's none of this like we do. We think about all the people who had this COVID and people who have been sick, even with the flu or maybe a cold. A lot of us have had colds or maybe surgeries where we go through the surgery, we get better. The surgery is over. We feel better. We've got everything out, but we're still not 100%. We're still dragging. People with this COVID, they still drag. They're slow. They're drained of energy. They're just weak. But notice this girl has been on the point of death. Jesus touches her hand. He speaks to her, and she gets up. She hops right up and begins walking. Now, this is another big thing, depending on how long this girl's been in bed, is if you've been in bed for an extended period of time, your legs are sore, your legs are numb, you have a hard time walking, but this girl gets up and she begins walking around. She's immediately healed. And again, her parents see this because, they were immediately, and again, it's not just the parents, this is the apostles, they were immediately overcome with amazement. There was no question this girl was healed completely. There's no question that this girl that was dead is now alive. And Jesus tells them, don't tell anybody what I did. Don't tell anyone that I raised her from the dead. Tell her I healed them. Tell her I healed her. Tell her I took care of her. Just don't tell them I raised them from the dead. Why? I told you earlier, Jesus doesn't want that publicity yet, because that's going to come. And when he gets the publicity for raising people from the dead, that's going to be when it costs him his life. When Jesus raises Lazarus, and everybody knows that the Jews are going to come hunting him. And so this is why Jesus says, don't tell anybody yet. Don't tell anybody what we did. Instead, he says, take the girl and give her something to eat. This is another idea that shows Jesus' compassion, because think of how many times we've been sick and we've been usually a stomach virus or even a cold or the flu. And, you get sick and you get wore out, but then as soon as it finally breaks and it's gone, you're starving. That's where this girl is. The family is so excited. They're so happy. They're so overjoyed that they've forgotten that this little girl's hungry. And Jesus says, look, don't tell nobody and feed the girl. She wants food. She's hungry. And so here we have another beautiful story about Jesus, that Jesus is the ruler over death. He's the ruler over disease. He's the ruler over demons, we've seen in this chapter. And then before that, we saw that he was ruler over the depths. He was ruler over the oceans. You see, Mark is writing us a gospel so that we can know that we have the Son of God before us, the Son of God that we should believe. And when you look at these stories, you look at what Jesus has done, you look at what Jesus has accomplished, there's no question that he is the Son of God. And that's why Mark wrote this book, so that we can know we have a God, the Son of God, who came to live and die for us, and to have a Son of God that cares for us, that's compassionate, that's willing to heal us, to take care of us, and heal us in a way we never knew we needed, to heal us of our sins, to make us whole, and to make us right with him. Appreciate you joining us tonight. We hope you've enjoyed this study of Mark. We're going to end our class right there, and we hope to see you all next Monday night. Thank you.